Hello, this will be the first video in our introduction to abstract thinking, ways of thinking abstractly and theoretical thinking. Videos will function like this. I will introduce you to different lines of thought that I have established, and these lines may be inconsistent, and they may overlap, and they may be even contradictory. But the point is not whether I'm right or wrong, but merely whether you begin to think in more abstract terms and begin to become comfortable with abstract terms. Yes, that will be it. Here's our first line of thought. I'm not from England, as you can clearly hear by my fake accent. One, and this is about distinctions and differences, and we'll take the distinctions first. One, it is the practice and most basic task of any science or academic field or any good discussion to make distinctions and to consider distinctions that have already been made. Two, to make a distinction is simply to, as you know, probably this is very basic, to distinguish between something and something else. Three, this already raises a variety of questions like the excluding of what from what and why and where and whom, and I will try to answer these questions in our next line of thought. This is the second line of thought on excluding a thing from what and how to make a distinction. One, I will say with the enthusiasm of a physics teacher to his new students, distinctions are everywhere. Two, when in the morning you consider what to wear for work or wherever you're going, you are making distinctions in your head and considering distinctions in your head. Minutes, hours, days, weeks are distinctions in time. Time is a distinction in reality. Reality is a distinction in subjective experience. Whatever I'm saying now, all the words that I'm saying are all given their meaning through their reference or making of distinctions. 4. The vague rule that we might consider from what I have just said is that everything is distinct. It is pretty obvious. Everything is distinct, and so we make distinctions between everything. Then we might consider problems such as our distinctions correct. Some atheists would claim that some Christian distinctions are not correct and stuff like that. 4. This is point 4, yes. The problem, however, is that and where science becomes important is that precisely that we do not at all agree which distinctions are correct and which are not, and which are most useful. We might produce through scientific method distinctions that will make us able to do useful things, such as the distinctions implied by what Newton knew about gravity or what Darwin discovered about evolution. This is our third line of thought. To describe a distinction. To describe a distinction at its most basic, I'm going to use a model that the famed theoreticist or theorist Niklas Luhmann, who is known for system theory, used, which he borrowed from the mathematician George Spencer Brown. And I must say that this is not an introduction to systems theory, and so I will not be using the model in the exact way that Luhmann used it. However, I might, if you want me to, make a video on system theory later. 2. We are speaking here of distinctions as they are made by people, whereas Luhmann he's more concerned with systems, so we might not speak of him anymore. This extremely simple model that I have drawn will tell us everything we need to know for now. 3, as you can see, it simply marks an inner space and an outer space, and the distinction itself. We might speak of the philosophical implications of a distinction as such, but right now I must simply say that in a completely literal sense, whenever you look at something, you may consider that you are not looking at something else. So it's pretty logical in that sense, and pretty basic. And I will also add that we will get into more complicated stuff maybe in later videos, but right now I'm just making the most basic introduction that I could think of. Yes. 5. You might also notice levels of abstraction in communication. Can we say that a car is simply a distinction, or is it a lot of distinctions? When communicating, we might say that you are, in a literal sense, making completely literal distinctions. But then there are also the things that you imply when you are speaking, like when your wife says that she has a headache, which might mean more than that, if you follow me. In this sense, we might say that some distinctions are themselves connected to other distinctions that are distinctions of their distinctions, and so on. Sixth point. Consider the word idiot. It is an abstraction. There are perhaps many idiots in the world, but there are currently no specific idiots in my sentence. 6.5. Idiot, then, is an abstraction in the sense that it limits the territory of what I could mean. So it could mean many things. We might attribute many characteristics to the word idiot. Also, depending on if we are speaking of a specific person, we might refer to his acts or his stupid face and stuff like that. 7. In this sense, the word idiot might in one context be a specific person and his characteristics and his traits, whatever he's done, whatever we think of him. And in another context, it might be a totally vague category of a variety of persons, such as what atheists mean when they say idiot about Christians, or what Christians mean when they say idiots about atheists, not knowing any of specific people that are actually members of that group or that distinction. 8. I will not go further into this troubled water, because we can end in an endless discussion, and there are already many philosophical fields taking on such discussions, and we might get into it later. But it is rather complicated. The point to note, however, is this. We might say stadium and point and refer to a specific football stadium in the middle of the city, for example. But if then we begin to discuss the artificial grass in a stadium, which this distinction might to some degree also imply, then we can open up an entire vocabulary of just chemistry and how that grass was made and how it was evolved during history. And if we talk about the seats of the stadium, we might get into an entire discussion of architecture and engineering. So in this sense, every distinction with a certain level of abstraction may be said to contain every other distinction, and the associations that we make may be endless. So now, who makes distinctions? This will be our fourth line of inquiry or thought. Well, the first point is, we all make distinctions, of course. That's obvious. But who is it really that makes distinctions? We might ask to get more into it. And the interesting thing in that question is, of course, that most of us live in a world filled with distinctions that were made before we were even born, such as money, for example. The thing that has, and all the distinctions that money implies. The second point that we might try to discuss is the validity of distinctions. Many philosophers make it their job to take up and discuss distinctions that we others take for granted. Us non-philosophers, ordinary people, yes, the layman and his rusty plow. A thing that, for example, charity is a set of distinctions, or might be considered to be a set of distinctions. And if you were to travel back in time and ask Nietzsche what he thought of charity, he would say to you that it's all well and fine, but it doesn't really help poor people. It just keeps them poor and alive, since it does not really change any of the economic or social relations that produced the poverty to begin with. So in that sense, Nietzsche might claim that charity is a false set of distinctions, or a set of distinctions that should be discussed in another way. Third point, getting into philosophy. A classical set of distinctions made in philosophy regarding categories of distinctions is to say that there is the subject, that is me, the individual, or some philosophers do not like the word individuals, so we will just stick with subject. But it's person anyway, sometimes, in some philosophy. Then there is language, and then there is the world of objects. So it's subject, language, object. Fourthly, we might say that distinctions are something that exists, or is something that exists in the two first categories, subject and language. In the world of objects, there are no distinctions. It is us humans that come in and observe them and make them. So We might say that distinctions are made by people and sustained in culture or language, as it would be. In the world of objects, or the territory as we might call it, there are, however, differences. And we might say, which is the basic premise of many sciences, that any distinction, the validity of it, must be considered in its relation to a difference in the real world of objects. So the fifth concluding point in this fourth line of inquiry or thought, what we might call it, is that we are now seeing the original split that is so often discussed in philosophy, namely between the thinking world, the world of ideas, as Plato would have put it, and the object world, the things as they are in themselves, as Kant would have said. Ding an sich is the German term that he used. Yes, I am very smart. And what we see here is that there are the differences that are really there in the world, and then there are our distinctions, which might not really apply to them when we actually look at the relations between them. For example, we might say that when global warming first became a subject in public discourse, that some people didn't believe it, so they made distinctions otherwise than what some of the evidence provided at that point pointed to. So this was a discussion between the differences that were actually observed regarding global warming and the distinctions that were then made by people regarding those differences. So in our fifth line of thought, we discuss differences. The first point, a critical researcher might accuse his colleague of making distinctions where there are no differences. An example of this can be the concept of gamification. Today we might observe that a supermarket has inserted a line of rules or observations regarding their consumers, giving them, those consumers who spend more privileges, so the consumers sort of level up. And I might, as a critical media science researcher, which I am, jump in and say, that is just like the computer games that I play when I have no job, which is all the time. That is gamification, that is. Second point then, when we look at the historical relations between various media and how they influence each other and how media influences everything else, or everything else influences the media, we might discover that it's entirely impossible to trace the relations between that supermarket and the games that we might claim that they are taking their rules from. So, in that sense, we may say that gamification is a distinction where there is no difference. Point 3. You have probably already noticed young, weirdly dressed academic types, young philosophers just starting in on their studies, going to parties and sitting in corners, and then when you approach them and ask if they want a beer or a blowjob or something, they just say, parties are a social construction, friendship is a social construction, and getting laid is certainly a social construction. They are, in other words, trying to imply that the nature of these abstract concepts of friendships and parties are merely distinctions without difference, and they do not really matter. Fourth point. To say that something is a social construction today is not the same as saying it 30 years ago, when the sociologists were still trying or in the middle of establishing themselves. This is a case of a distinction which has over time lost its validity. To say that a social construction, as Bruno Latour has taught us in his Reassembling the Social, means little. It is to say that it doesn't really say anything that what is in fact a social construction, and to say that that is really just a social construction, as if that means something. Of course a party is a social construction. What else would it be? Of course friendship is a social construction. What could it be if it was not that? And so we learn that distinctions change, their validity changed with the evolvement or evolution of society. And a last side note, imagine if a mechanic stopped fixing engines because he discovered that they were constructions. It would be absurd. When discussing distinctions and differences and their relation, a very annoying question is often asked. Can we be objective? Do our distinctions probably cover the territory or differences that they attempt to describe or purport to relate to? Well, the short answer is no, they don't. But to say that we are not objective and cannot really know the existence of anything real is not the point that should be made in this context. The point, however, is simply that because of our distinctions, because of our need to describe, everything that we do describe is tangled with in a sort of way. We can only know of the differences that we perceive through the distinctions that we make. And that is the problematic aspect of that. It does not mean that we cannot know the existence of anything, or we cannot gather any knowledge, and everything is just subjective and we can't do anything. It's not what it means, really. So this will be the second point in our sixth line. I think I forgot to introduce it. The problem of objectivity is not that things don't really exist. The problem of objectivity is that in any sort of communication that we make, that is distinctions that we make, there is always an intention on our part, and that intention obfuscates the things that we are trying to produce objective knowledge with. That is the idea that whenever a politician says, let the facts speak for themselves, well, facts don't ever speak for themselves. They are always made to speak by simply being described. So in our third point, we might say that a message from a physics department contained true information about some physics experiment, true empirically correct information. But however, from the perspective of information theory, we might say that the true importance of the message was the medium with which it was communicated. Or we might say from the perspective of sociology or psychology that the true meaning of the message was the relation that it illustrated between the sender and the receiver. So whenever we look at it, the true information of it can be proven to refer to a difference, but the travel of information in between us humans is simply more complicated than that. 3.5, I'm just adding a note that while the burden of proof is always on the sender, the interpretation of the message is always at the receiving end. So we might be extremely careful in describing and gathering the evidence of whatever we are going to say, but it doesn't matter if the receiver simply has another agenda in receiving it. This is often what happens whenever true, empirically correct facts are transmitted from the academia into the world of politics or other arenas that it might enter into. It will be obfuscated simply by the intentions that other people think it implies, the receivers. This is our seventh line and the conclusion. Point 1. Distinctions and differences are everywhere, as I said before. But distinctions are not always valid due to their relation or specific relations to their differences. And it is also very important to note that what I've been describing here is not a material. There are no distinctions in the territory or the real world, as we say. They are abstractions. They are our thought productions, our communicative productions, and they are the way in which we perceive the world around us. Second, the validity of our distinctions, as I've said, may be said to relate to the differences that they purport to describe. When we make a distinction, we imply that this distinction is true, that something in our actual world is reliant on that distinction. To prove the validity of distinctions is basically what the sciences do every day. Every field and every science tries to devise different methods and utilize different tools in order to properly observe the differences that they describe with their distinctions. Well, that was that. I hope it's been helpful, and I hope that you will comment with whatever commentaries you have. Is my accent not consistent enough? Do you want more references for that project you are making? Or whatever, did you like it? Yes, you could like and subscribe maybe. Some people might do that. If you hated it, we would also like you to use your hate and sort of communicate it to us in whatever irrational ways that you can think of, and maybe we will provide you with more fuel in the future for your hatred. Yes.